Welcome to the debate. Today we are putting a massive question mark behind, well, one of the most dominant health trends of the last decade. We are stripping away the influencer marketing and looking strictly at the data regarding intermittent fasting.
Yeah, it is the trend that everyone's coworker is doing right now. But the question we are asking today is a bit uncomfortable for the true believers. Is intermittent fasting a distinct metabolic miracle, or is it just a glorified, highly difficult way of skipping breakfast to cut calories?
And I am taking the position that it is a distinct metabolic intervention. We are diving deep into some really comprehensive new data from 2025 and 2026 today. We have a massive meta-analysis of 99 randomized controlled trials published in the International Journal of Creative Research Thoughts. We will just refer to it as the IJCRT today, along with some critical reviews from Frontiers in Nutrition and the Nutrition Journal.
And I am here to argue that when you strip away the biohacking vocabulary, the data shows that intermittent fasting, or IF, works primarily because it restricts calories. It is a tool, sure, but the metabolic magic narrative is largely overstated, and the adherence data suggests it is definitely not the lifestyle fix people think it is.
Let's start with my core thesis here. I believe the 2025 data proves that when you eat dictates how your body processes energy. This is not just about calories in, calories out. It is about metabolic switching.
Right.
When you pull the levers of time and frequency, you trigger mechanisms, specifically shifting the body from running on glucose to running on ketones, that simple calorie restriction just does not achieve.
See, that is the theory. That is the elevator pitch. But I look at the practical outcomes. You are talking about cellular mechanisms, and I'm looking at the scale and the long-term feasibility. My position, which is backed by the Soundbites review and the Frontiers data, is that while the math looks good on paper for aggressive fasting, the practical reality for the average person is messy.
Well,
Most people are not doing the aggressive protocols that generate the best data. They are doing the easy versions, and the results there are statistically whelming, not overwhelming.
I think you are being way too dismissive of the physiology right out of the gate. The IJCRT meta-analysis is quite damning to the idea that this is just calorie restriction. When they analyzed those 99 RCTs, which, by the way, involved over 6,500 participants, they found a clear hierarchy. Alternate day fasting, where you alternate between a day of feasting and a day of total or near total fasting, demonstrated superior weight loss compared to continuous calorie restriction. We are talking about a mean difference of negative 1.29 kilograms in favor of fasting. That is a statistical edge that standard dieting simply didn't have.
I see why you rely on that number, the negative 1.29 kilograms. It is statistically significant, sure. But is it clinically earth-shattering? That is roughly 3 pounds difference over the course of an entire study. And let's look at the context of that number. You are citing alternate day fasting. That is a grueling protocol. You are asking people to go 24 hours without food every other day.
but effective is effective. If the question is, does it work better? The data says yes.
Only if you do it. The Soundbites review makes a critical distinction that often gets lost in these flashy headlines. Most people are not doing alternate day fasting. They are doing time-restricted eating, usually the 16.8 method. Skip breakfast, eat lunch and dinner. And the data there is far less impressive.
It still works, though.
Weight loss for time-restricted eating is often in the 3 to 4% range, whereas alternate day fasting hits that 4 to 8% range. You are using the success of the extreme protocol to validate the popularity of the mild one.
That is a fair distinction, but I would frame it differently. You are critiquing the popularity of the protocol rather than the efficacy of the physiology itself. The fact remains that when intermittent fasting is combined with calorie restriction, the gap widens further. The IJCRT data showed a negative 2.11 kilogram advantage over standard dieting. That is nearly 5 pounds of extra weight loss just by changing the timing. That suggests the metabolic switch is real. It is amplifying the deficit.
Or it is just harder to overeat when you only have an 8-hour window. I am not convinced that is magic. I think that is just logistics. If I tell you to eat 2,000 calories in 4 hours, you are going to struggle to do it simply because of stomach volume. That is physics, not metabolism.
But the data suggests it is not just weight, it is about body composition too. The IJCRT analysis highlighted preferential fat mass loss while preserving lean mass. This directly counters the old gym bro science that says if you don't eat every 3 hours, your muscles will literally fall off. The body is smarter than that.
Okay, let's stop right there. I have to push back hard on this preferential fat loss claim. I don't buy it without massive caveats. The Soundbites review was quite explicit about this. It suggests that intermittent fasting generally follows the exact same biological rule as standard dieting. About 75% of the weight you lose is fat and 25% is lean mass.
Unless you train.
Right, unless you are engaging in heavy resistance training, the fasting window itself is not acting as some kind of magical force field around your biceps.
I think you are overlooking the nuance in the new data, particularly regarding the hierarchy of fasting protocols we touched on earlier. Let's go back to that separation between alternate day fasting and time-restricted eating. You mentioned that time-restricted eating is weak, but the IJCRT findings position alternate day fasting as a statistical heavyweight. There was a 2025 University of Colorado study cited in the analysis that utilized a 4.3 protocol.
Wait, that is fasting 3 days a week?
Exactly. 3 non-consecutive days of total fasting. It resulted in 7.6% body weight loss versus only 5.0% for daily calorie restriction over the exact same period. That is a statistically significant and clinically relevant difference. It is almost 50% more effective.
Again, that is a compelling argument for efficacy on paper. But have you considered the dropout rates for a 4.3 protocol? Fasting for 3 full days a week is socially isolating and physically grueling. But let's stick to the numbers for a moment. You are championing alternate day fasting, but I want to bring us back to the Frontiers in Nutrition 2025 systematic review, which specifically looked at overweight women. They found that while time-restricted eating reduced weight by about 1.9 kilograms, it showed no significant effect on BMI or fat mass compared to controls in some analyses.
Because you are looking at the weaker protocol.
But it is the protocol everyone actually uses. And that study is a major blow to the idea that the window itself is driving the fat loss. If the window was magic, we should see body composition changes even without massive calorie deficits. We don't.
I am not convinced by that line of reasoning because you are isolating one specific demographic, overweight women, and one specific protocol, time-restricted eating. But even within time-restricted eating, the landmarked treaty trial you are likely referencing, which showed no significant difference, has been criticized heavily for its timing windows. The metabolic benefits are often tied to early time-restricted eating, which aligns with circadian rhythms. Eating from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. is metabolically completely different than eating from 12 p.m. to 8 p.m.
We will get to the circadian rhythms and the early eating in a moment, because I admit that is interesting data. But I want to stay on this comparison of efficacy. The treaty trial found that 8-hour time-restricted eating combined with calorie restriction performed no better than calorie restriction alone after 12 months. That is the gold standard of comparison. If I tell you to eat 1,500 calories between 12 p.m. and 8 p.m., or 1,500 calories spread throughout the day, the weight loss outcome is statistically identical in the long term. The magic seems to wear off once the novelty of the schedule fades.
I see the data you are pointing to, but I interpret the long-term convergence differently. The fact that outcomes converge after 24 weeks doesn't negate the initial metabolic advantage. But let's tackle the body composition issue you raised earlier. You cited the 75-25 rule for fat versus muscle loss. However, the IJCRT analysis found a mean difference of negative 1.08 kilograms of fat mass in favor of fasting strategies. That indicates a specific mechanism is preserving lean tissue better than standard dieting.
Or it indicates that the subjects in the fasting groups were consuming more protein or perhaps moving differently. I rely on the Soundbites review here, which states clearly that intermittent fasting doesn't inherently save muscle without resistance training. Think about it logically. If you stop eating for 16 hours, your body doesn't suddenly decide to burn only fat. It burns what is available. And if you aren't stimulating the muscle, you are going to lose it, just like on any other diet. In fact, cramming your protein needs into a short window is harder. Can you eat 150 grams of protein in 2 meals? Most people can't.
That is a valid logistical challenge. I will grant you that. Getting adequate protein in a tight window requires planning, but mechanistically, we know that metabolic switching enhances mitochondrial efficiency and autophagy.
Let's define that for the listener, because autophagy gets thrown around a lot. It is essentially cellular cleanup, right?
Exactly. It is the body's recycling program. When you are eating constantly, your cells are in growth mode. When you stop eating for an extended period, they switch to repair mode. They start degrading and recycling old, damaged proteins and organelles to use for energy. There is a theoretical framework, supported by the IJCRT data, that this process protects muscle tissue during a deficit because the body becomes more efficient at using what it has. It cleans house rather than burning the house down for fuel.
I think that is a poetic way to put it. And if we were talking about mice, I would be 100% on board. But in humans, the data is just messier. But frankly, if combining intermittent fasting with resistance training leads to muscle maintenance or even gain, despite a calorie deficit, as some studies suggest, then the protocol is facilitating that outcome better than the fatigue often associated with chronic low-grade calorie restriction.
I think that is the key right there. It preserves energy levels for the workout better than the constant drip of low calories.
That is a fair point on the resistance training combination, but I would argue the resistance training is doing the heavy lifting there, pun intended, not the fasting. But let's pivot. You keep hinting at metabolic switching and internal health. This is where I think your case is actually strongest and where I have the most questions.
Absolutely. This is where intermittent fasting truly shines, regardless of the weight on the scale. We have a 2025 meta-analysis from the Journal of Chemical Health Risks that is incredibly robust. It shows that intermittent fasting significantly reduces HOMA-IR.
And for those who don't read lab reports for fun, HOMA-IR is our primary marker for insulin resistance. It essentially tells us how hard your pancreas is working to keep your blood sugar stable.
Correct. And the analysis shows a reduction in HOMA-IR of 0.32. That might sound small to a layperson, but clinically, that is significant. It means the body is becoming more sensitive to its own insulin. But here is the key: early time-restricted eating, or ETRE. This is where you stop eating by roughly 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. This protocol aligns food intake with our circadian clocks. The data shows robust effects on waist circumference, a reduction of 3.21 centimeters, which is a proxy for visceral fat, the dangerous fat around your organs.
Stop eating at 4 p.m. Look, I come at it from a different way, which is looking at the human being living the life. While the physiology of early time-restricted eating might be sound, and I fully acknowledge the Journal of Chemical Health Risks findings on waist circumference, the feasibility is near zero for the average working adult. No family dinner, no social drinks, no dinner date.
But we are debating efficacy, not convenience.
But convenience drives adherence. But more importantly, I question if these metabolic improvements are independent of weight loss. The Soundbites review suggests that when you lose 5% of your body weight, your insulin sensitivity improves, period. It doesn't matter if you lost it by fasting or by cutting portions. If you shrink the fat cell, the insulin signaling works better.
That is a common assumption. But the Journal of Chemical Health Risks explicitly notes that benefits can be independent of weight loss. The metabolic switch itself, the lowering of insulin for extended periods, allows the body to restore insulin sensitivity in a way that chronic grazing simply does not. If you are constantly snacking, your insulin never drops to baseline. Fasting forces that drop. Even without massive weight loss, we see improvements in glycemic control, with HbA1c reductions of 0.9%. That is massive for a pre-diabetic.
It is impressive, I will grant you that. An A1C drop of almost 1% is basically the effect of a pharmaceutical intervention. That is hard to ignore. But we also have to look at the safety signals. The Nutrition Journal published a meta-analysis in 2025 that raised a flag. Short-term intermittent fasting, specifically under 12 weeks, might result in a temporary elevation of triglycerides. If we are touting heart health, we need to be transparent about that lipid volatility.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. The data suggests that is a transient effect, likely due to the mobilization of fat stores,
Think about it. When you are liberating fat from adipose tissue to be burned as fuel, you are going to see more free fatty acids and triglycerides in the bloodstream temporarily. You have to move the fuel to burn the fuel. The long-term data from the same analyses generally shows improvements or neutrality in lipid profiles once the weight stabilizes. It is part of the process, not a side effect.
Neutrality is a far cry from superiority, though. If I can get neutrality with a balanced Mediterranean diet without the hunger pangs, why would I choose the fasting? And this brings me to the elephant in the room, sustainability. We can argue about mitochondrial efficiency all day long, but if people quit, it doesn't matter. The dropout rates in these studies are telling. We see a range from 0% all the way up to 65% in some trials. That is massive variability.
Adherence is a challenge for any lifestyle intervention. Have you ever tried to track every single calorie in an app for a year? It is miserable. The IJCRT analysis actually found that adherence rates for IF were comparable to calorie restriction. For people who hate counting calories, who find the mental math of eating a little bit less all day to be torture, intermittent fasting is a viable alternative. It simplifies the rule set. You eat or you don't. It removes the decision fatigue.
I'm sorry, but I just don't believe that it's simpler in the long run. It creates a binge and restrict cycle for a lot of people. The Soundbites review highlighted that weight regain rates within 5 years surpass 80% for traditional methods. And there is simply not enough long-term data, we're talking greater than 1 year, to prove intermittent fasting solves this yo-yo problem. In fact, relying on a rigid clock can sometimes lead to binge eating behaviors during the window. The what the hell effect. Oh, my window closes in 10 minutes. I better eat everything in the kitchen. It isn't a behavior change miracle. It is just a restriction mechanism.
But for many, that restriction mechanism is safer than the alternative. The adverse events recorded in these 99 RCTs were generally transient and mild. Headaches, dizziness, hunger, these resolve as the body adapts. Compare that to the psychological fatigue of measuring every gram of food for years. I would argue that learning to sit with hunger, learning that you won't die if you skip a meal, is a highly valuable psychological skill.
Safe, yes. Effective for everyone? Absolutely not. And I think we need to be careful not to oversell the metabolic switch to someone who simply needs to improve their food quality. You can fast for 20 hours a day, but if you break that fast with ultra-processed garbage, you aren't going to see these improved health markers. A 4-hour window of pizza is still pizza.
We agree on food quality, certainly. You cannot outfast a bad diet. That is a universal truth. But I think the 2025 and 2026 data vindicates intermittent fasting, specifically alternate day fasting and early time-restricted eating, as superior tools for specific jobs. If you are looking for fat loss, the negative 1.29 kilogram advantage of ADF is real. If you are looking to fix insulin resistance, the HOMA-IR data is compelling. It is more than just a diet, it is a metabolic reset.
And I maintain that it is a tool, not a magic wand. Time-restricted eating, the version almost everyone actually tries, is metabolically weaker than alternate day fasting. The data clearly shows that. And in the long term, the results converge with standard dieting. It works because it creates a calorie deficit. If you can sustain it, great. If not, you aren't missing out on some physiological miracle by just eating a healthy breakfast and watching your portions.
It seems we are looking at the same landscape but focusing on different horizons. I see the peaks of what is possible with protocols like alternate day fasting, the potential to reverse insulin resistance without medication. I see the biology.
While I am focused on the valleys of adherence and the averages of time-restricted eating, I'm looking at the psychology. I'm looking at the person who tries it, gets a headache, snaps at their kids, and quits after 3 weeks.
That's a fair assessment. And I think for the listener, the takeaway has to be about personalization.
I agree. If you have significant insulin resistance, or if you're pre-diabetic, the data suggests intermittent fasting, perhaps even the more aggressive alternate day fasting, might offer benefits that standard dieting cannot touch. The HMI reduction alone might be worth a hassle.
But if you are someone who cannot imagine going 24 hours without food, or if stopping dinner at 4 p.m. destroys your family life, then the superior statistics of those protocols are irrelevant to you.
The best diet is the one you can stick to in 5 years, not just 5 weeks. And if you are going to do IF, you need to be mindful of that protein intake.
Don't let your muscles waste away because you couldn't fit the chicken breast into your window.
And we should also reflect on the nuance of early time-restricted eating. Even if you don't do the full protocol, the science is nudging us toward the idea that when you eat matters, specifically relative to daylight. It is not just about skipping breakfast. It might be about skipping the late-night snack.
That is something the data supports, that we can likely all agree on. Nothing good happens metabolically at 11 p.m.
We encourage you to look at the material, look at your own lifestyle, and decide which protocol, if any, fits your biology. Thank you for listening to the debate.